Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steve Wilson from the Illinois State Water Survey, and I'm here with Dan Webb from the Water Survey, Jennifer Wilson, and Katie Hollenbeck, both from the Water Resources Center, presenting a webinar today on what realtors need to know about homes with well water. And I want to mention that this is part of the Private Well Class program, which is a class and videos and podcasts and a whole bunch of media that's a program to teach well owners about being good stewards of their wells and those sorts of things. It's funded through US EPA by the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, who's our lead on all this work. So today's webinar, as I said, is part of a national program implemented through RCAP. It's national in scope, and the materials follow our course, which is privatewellclass.org. If you haven't been to that site and you heard about this another way, I certainly recommend you take a look. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be on YouTube and on our videos page, so that if folks want to share it or aren't able to attend today, we can make it available. And at the end, depending on how long this takes, we'll have time for more questions. Everyone who registered was allowed a chance to provide questions for today, and we got a bunch. So we're going to try to go through those first. So today we're going to talk about issues that are important to home buyers and sellers, really. Some basic water quality information and well construction basics to give you as a realtor an idea of some of the issues that are probably most important in understanding how a well might come into play during a property transaction. We'll go through most of the questions that we've received, as I mentioned before, and I've already said here, Jennifer Wilson and Katie Hollenbeck from the Water Resources Center, they're fielding all the questions you might have on GoToWebinar, so the little box you have on the right side, there's a place there for questions. If something comes up during the webinar, they'll field those and we'll get to them at the end. And again, Dan Webb, who's a chemist here at the Water Survey and runs our public service lab, which some of you may have used in the past if you're from Illinois, will be answering any water quality questions at the end that might come up. So the real deal here is that many well owners have never sampled their well. They don't really understand the issues related to their wells. And so your job as a realtor is to really make sure they understand what those issues are. If you're the seller, poor construction or poor water quality can lead to reduced property values. And so that may require that some upfront costs for repair or treatment in order to make the home ready for sale. As a buyer, it's not only that you want to be sure you're buying a property that will retain its value and your family can drink the water and not worry about their health, but it's also to help them understand what it means to be a well owner, having to maintain a well, what risks they might have based on where their well's located or what kind of chemistry the groundwater has in that area, and if there already is treatment, what's that cost and what's the maintenance. They need to really understand that up front, and most don't. We even had a professor here on campus who came from New York City and bought a house out in the country near Homer, Illinois, called us after a couple months and was completely lost. He had a bored well and had no idea how to take care of it. And, that really shouldn't happen. And so, one of the things we certainly recommend, one of the best ways that you can be prepared to help your clients is to take our class. It'll teach you a lot about a private well if you aren't already aware, and help you understand the issues they might have. So whether you represent the buyer or the seller, these are three things that we consider as probably the critical pieces for a property transfer as far as you as a realtor go. One is to do an inspection of the well and the water system. Many states they're not required, but it's still a best practice, and it puts everybody on the same playing field. Test the drinking water. Most lenders require that now anyway, but the buyer may want to do it on their own. The seller, there's an advantage to them doing that in advance. And lastly, both inform your client and be informed yourself. And that means taking the time to learn a little bit more about private wells and some of the issues that are related to that. And I'll go into these in more detail. First, though, there are really two issues that are kind of the most paramount, if you will, regarding wells. One is the type of well that somebody has. There are three types of wells: border dug wells or large diameter wells. There are also wells that are finished in sand and gravel aquifers and wells that are finished in bedrock aquifers. And I'm going to discuss the details of each of those and why they're important. So a border dug well is usually installed where there is no real aquifer available. And so you put in a large diameter well that allows water to seep in near the surface. And so that right there is a flag, because water near the surface is more likely to have surface influence from contaminants, either agricultural or whatever, septic, all those things. And the way these work is water seeps in from the water table or maybe thin sand lenses. These wells are typically less than 50 feet deep, and the water is coming from near the surface. These are 3 wells that are in Illinois. We've actually sampled all of these wells as part of a project here at the Water Survey in the past. The one on the right and the lower left are both properly constructed wells. The cement tile you see on the right, it's a 3-foot tile with a cap. Those are 4-foot sections going down vertically, and at each section they're just set on top of each other. There's a bevel, and so water can seep in at each of those joints. And the one on the lower left has 10 feet of 6-inch pipe going down to where the large diameter part of the well starts. And the point of that is, and that's part of the code in Illinois now, is to help protect from water seeping in at 3 or 4 feet, so that it has to travel at least a little further through the soil, which provides a little protection. The well on top is an old hand-dug well. Many people still use these in rural areas. I grew up on one in central Illinois. This well is about, I think, 6-foot diameter maybe. It's got 2x10 wood covering it with tin over top of that with some cement blocks keeping it all in place. This is a cattle pasture. Each of those posts looks so worn because the cattle come and rub on them. It's got a decent slope, so the cornfield up to the up-gradient side, when there's a lot of rain, there's a lot of runoff that comes down to this well. It's not a safe construction, and it's dangerous for surface contamination. And that's one of the problems that we typically have. There are many of these wells that are still in existence all over the country. And some are abandoned and not used anymore, but they're not sealed, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But these wells in particular, dug and bored wells, are of most concern generally because they're shallow and they get their water from a shallow part of the soil and the ground. And we did a study back in the 90s in Illinois looking at pesticide and nitrate contamination based on depth to aquifer, and these types of wells were by far the most contaminated percentage-wise than any others that we tested. Here's 2 types of construction. The one on the left is the 3-foot tile all the way up to the surface, the picture I showed with the big circular concrete lid, and the one on the right is the one that was on the lower left with a regular red monitor cap. And you can see here they're meant for storage. That's the bottom line. There's hardly any sand or aquifer material in the ground where these wells are, and so water seeps in slowly from clay or till or some sand lenses, and they're meant to store water so that there's always enough available, and that's how they operate. Sand and gravel wells, on the other hand, have a screen. They're finished in sand, and water can flow readily through sand, so you have a screen to keep the sand out but let the water in. The screens are sized based on the size of the sand grains and the particular aquifer you might be tapping into. They can either be PVC or steel casing. The thing you need to understand is that water only gets in the well around the screen. So if the well's 100 feet deep and the screen is the bottom 5 feet, that means water is entering the well from 95 to 100 feet. The other 95 feet is a solid casing, and no water can get in the well. And so you know that you're protected from the surface in that case because the water's got to travel through 95 feet of soil and aquifer material in order to get in the well, and that provides a little protection from surface contamination. Sand and soil are a natural filter. Here's what that looks like. Down at the bottom here on the diagram is a submersible pump. You can see the horizontal lines for the well screen, and the rest is solid casing up to the surface. And so that's in contrast to a bedrock well, which most of the time, in some places it's not true. They put casing all the way down or for a lot longer length, but most of the time when you put in a bedrock well, you only put casing 10 to 20 feet into the bedrock. So if the bedrock is near the surface, or say at 15 or 20 feet, you might only have 30 or 40 feet of casing. And in this example, you can see where it says steel casing, and then on the right side it says 10 to 20 feet of casing into bedrock. The casing stops at the bottom of that arrow, and the rest of that hole is open. Bedrock is solid, so it can act as the casing itself, and you have it open so that you can take advantage of fractures. In a bedrock aquifer, water is mostly flowing through fractures and fissures in the rock, not through the rock itself. And so how much water a well might produce is really dependent on how many fractures that well bore actually intercepts. And the more fractures, generally the more water. That means a couple things. One, this particular well, if it's 100 feet deep, let's say there's only casing to 40 feet, water can enter the well from 40 feet to 100 feet. In some cases, bedrock may be much closer to the surface, and there might only be 15 or 20 feet of casing, which means it's more susceptible to surface contamination. And understanding that, looking at a well log and seeing, yeah, there's 200 feet of casing here, or there's only 40 feet of casing, make a difference on the water quality and potential issues you might have. And that also means, depending on the number of fractures, that it can be influenced over a larger area. If a well happens to only intercept one fracture and it's fairly small, maybe it extends back up to the surface, even a half a mile away. But when you pump your well, that water is traveling through that fracture almost like a pipe. And so it can come from much further away, which means there's potential for influences from further away from the well as well. So well type matters is the bottom line. In a dug and bored well, there's really no aquifer, and most of the time we find dug wells, hand dug wells, are very old. The well I grew up on, my grandpa hand dug in 1933. It's 14 feet deep, it's uncemented brick, and it's susceptible. Large rainstorm, our water would be cloudy for a couple days, so it's just not a good situation. Sand and gravel wells are either drilled or driven, and a well into bedrock or consolidated rock is usually drilled. So in some cases you might have choices. Somebody might have an old dug well, and you find out from the State Geological Survey or from your DNR or other agency that there's actually a really good bedrock aquifer 150 feet below. If I had an old hand dug well, I would probably put in a new well into bedrock in that case. In other cases, you don't have a choice. Where I grew up, we had no other aquifer to choose from, so we have a dug well, and that's what's still at that farm today. Understanding the log, I'm not going to go into that today, but if you have a log for a property, it gives you a lot of information. You can either ask the State Geological Survey or, again, the agency that regulates well construction, or the scientific surveys to interpret that for you and tell you what it means. A lot of times they have information about how much water they might pump and how much drawdown there is if they do pump. And so those things are really valuable as you try to understand what your situation is for an individual property. So if you do have poor construction, our advice, and obviously we're not footing the bill, but if your state has construction codes, they've changed a lot over the last 30 years, and wells have always been grandfathered in. But what I would do is, if you have a well that doesn't meet code, especially if it shows some kind of risk at the surface or a safety hazard, like a well in a pit or an old hand-dug well, I would bring those up to code if you can, or at least determine if there's another aquifer where you can put in a separate well. Here's two examples. The well on the right, there's standing water in it, and the well on the left, somebody had an old board over top of their well. There's their jet pump, so it's a shallow well. The lady probably walked over that 1,000 times, and one too many, she fell in, it killed her. And so they're not only a risk for her health in the water quality, but also for just being a safety hazard. And you can see how the area around this well, it looks like it's in a building. It could be in a basement for all that matter. But either way, things can fall in the well, then your pump pumps that into your home and you're drinking that water. And so it's important to understand all those things, and I'll get to this in a minute, but that's why a well inspection is really necessary for most properties. So again, whether you represent the buyer or the seller, do an inspection. And for the seller, it means that you're prepared. You can make corrections before you list the property. And if there already is treatment in place, you can make sure it's working properly and know what potential issues you might have. And I realize that's an expense, and a lot of people don't want to do that, but it'll save you in the long run. If someone comes in, a buyer who is informed, and they realize, one, the treatment system, if there is, say it's a filter or an RO unit or whatever, isn't been kept up, an RO unit that isn't maintained, once the filter gets clogged, can be a source of bacteria there's just a lot of issues. And so it's better to understand what they might be and make those corrections ahead of time. And as the buyer, obviously you want to protect yourself both for your property value standpoint and from your health. And an inspection will do that for you. What I wanted to show, this is from the state of Wisconsin. They actually have, to me, they do things the right way in regard to well inspections. They have a law that says if you get a well inspection, it's voluntary. You don't have to do it. But if you do, then you have to follow these rules. You have to use a licensed well contractor, and you have to fill out this form. This is the top half of the form. I'll show the bottom half in a minute. But what they want to ensure is that if someone's having an inspection done and spending money for that, that it's done properly. And that's what we should all want. And so they gauge what's proper and what should be done by what their current well construction codes are. So when we look at the bottom half of this, and you can see here it says, well owners are not required to bring systems into compliance as a result of the inspection, and the inspector only provides the form to the requester of the inspection. They don't want to see the forms. So it's do it the right way, but this is really between the buyer, the seller, and their agents. And so it's really the best of both worlds. It protects both the buyer and the seller, and it also ensures that the work is done properly. And these non-complying features, some of these are pretty small things like 21. If the casing height isn't at least a foot, I'm assuming that's their code. Maybe it's only 8 inches or 6 inches because the ground's been heaved up in the area. But there's things that are more serious. Number 10 is a well at risk for flooding. We see a lot of wells that are in floodplains where they wanted to put the well up by the house, but there's no aquifer there. There's a nice stream a couple hundred yards back on the property, so they end up putting the well down near the stream where there's some sand available to do that. By doing this and doing this form, the buyer and the seller understand what the issues are, and it does affect the price of a property, and it should. And we get into that a lot as far as, well, I guess I don't want to say, as far as what you should and shouldn't do and what you're legally required to do. That's one of the questions we received, matter of fact. But the idea here is best practices and doing the best you can to ensure that no one is surprised later or that something was neglected, and you could even end up in court. Case of not mentioning a well, for instance. If there's a well on the property, an old abandoned well or it isn't abandoned properly, and you know about it, but nobody says anything, eventually that could be a problem, especially if somebody gets hurt. It could become a litigation issue. It's just best to do the right thing up front. As far as the things they look for, this is Minnesota's statute for setback distances for a well. In every state it's different. For instance, the septic tank or holding tank for Minnesota is 50 feet. You have to put a well 50 feet from a septic or holding tank. It might be different in your state if you're in a different state. I use this one for all the presentations I give because it's very comprehensive. This is the top half of the page. It just gives you an idea of all the things you need to think about related to a well. And so for that Wisconsin form I just showed you, the contractor would look against Wisconsin's regulations for distances, and if they don't meet those distances, let's say it's within, it's less than 100 feet from an animal feedlot, they would mark that as a deficiency or a non-complying feature. What the buyer and the seller do with that is completely up to them. Nobody has to do anything. Maybe the buyer isn't concerned. That kind of depends on the well. If it's a 500-foot well that's got casing down to 300 feet and it's well protected at the surface, the fact that the feedlot is within 60 feet instead of 100 feet probably isn't going to make a difference to the water quality in that well. But those are the kind of things that have to be a judgment call, and that's why we have these setback distances in the first place, is to protect folks who may not have the wherewithal to understand some of these issues. And really, as their agent, you should be looking out for them on some of these topics. And I'm just showing this again, just compared to the last picture, even an old hand pump, or if there's an old dug well nearby. In some states it's required, well, in Minnesota, for instance, you're required to disclose every well on a property, whether they're being used or not, and failure to do so is illegal. So it's just a way to make sure that everything either complies with the code for the current day, and the well owner and the buyer and the seller are both aware of that. It's just to give information to make it, so everybody's on the same playing field again, to make it fair, if you will. So the second best practice is really to test your water, or test the water at the home. We certainly recommend that the seller do that on their own. One, to make sure that they know what's going on. If you have a bacteria problem, you have an old dug well, when you sample your well, you may have someone interested in buying the property. They can't buy it because their lender won't allow it because it's got an issue with coliform bacteria, or it may be something else. Maybe there is naturally occurring arsenic there. And so if you're representing the seller, it's always best to get a water sample in advance before listing. So if there is anything that needs to be corrected, or you might consider adding treatment, it can be done in advance. One, it shows the buyer that you're progressive and you're doing everything on the up and up, and should add value to the property, versus they come in, or the lender comes in and collects a sample and finds out that it doesn't meet some health-based standard. And one of the things I read online is, you should always test for chlorine if you're the buyer. I never thought about that, but might have a situation where a well is continually getting bacteria in it, but if you chlorinate it, it might be fine for a few weeks or a month, and before it becomes contaminated again. Coliform bacteria is an indicator. It means that there's a pathway into your well, and if there is such a pathway, it's likely the well will get contaminated again. And if you have done something to the well, like you've opened the cap and replaced the pump, and then you have bacteria in your well, it could be because of that maintenance work that was done. So you chlorinate your well and disinfect it, and you may never have another problem. But if you have a reoccurring problem, that means there's a pathway that you either have to try to fix with the well, or if that's not possible, you need to ensure that you're protecting your health from E. coli and other bacteria. One way to do that would be to install an inline chlorinator that continuously chlorinates your water like a community water supply does. And I know you run into people who say, well, I don't like the taste of that or whatever, but it's about protecting your health. And if your water has chlorine in it, when you test it as the buyer, then I would certainly ask the questions: has this well been contaminated, and how often have you tested it, and try to get an indication of that. And if the seller isn't coming forward with information, I'd consider walking away, because there's probably an issue there. And one of the questions that you folks asked is about cost of wells. They're an investment, in some cases more than a car. And so it's not something to take lightly or to just assume will be okay. And So what to test for? Every situation is different. So if it's a dug well versus a bedrock well, it depends on the depth, if the well's secure at the surface and constructed properly, what formation it's in. There's an aquifer in Wisconsin that they've legislated out, basically. You can't finish a well in that unit because the arsenic's so high. In other parts of the country, there may be other kinds of contaminants. I think I show some pictures of that in a minute. It really, you need to do your homework and ask your county. If for instance, if there's high arsenic in wells in an aquifer in a specific county, I guarantee you the county health department or the state health department know about it. So ask them for advice. Find out what's there. There's also things online. I'll show you some of those before we get done, where you might be able to find out that information because the state's already put a lot of it up and made it publicly available. So any contaminants that might be in an area, you should investigate that, especially if you're coming into a new area as a buyer. It's, you're moving from, New York to Illinois. You should check with the State Water Survey or the State Geological Survey and the County Health Department and find out if there's any instance of, arsenic or any other contaminant that might be naturally occurring. And it's better to ask. And again, lender may have requirements for the buyer, but sometimes, the way, like for FHA, the way it reads, if there's a county health requirement for sampling, you can follow that. That may be just coliform nitrate and pH. And if there's not, then you can use a state requirement. And if the state doesn't have a requirement, then they want you to use the U.S. EPA's primary drinking water standards, which is a really ambiguous rule. To follow that to the in the teeth of the law would cost, there's there's a lot of primary drinking water contaminants that communities have to meet. They have to test at least a few times for until they can prove they don't have them. Then they can go on a different monitoring schedule. They're regularly tested. All those things for a homeowner to try to sample for all the things that are MCLs from US EPA would be thousands and thousands of dollars. And so that's a separate issue. But it depends on your lender, and you just need to deal with what they say, basically. Again, natural groundwater quality, there are a lot of contaminants that just occur in the ground. Arsenic, I'll probably say this later again, but it's the seventh most common element in the Earth's crust. It exists in a lot of places in the country. It's not because of, it can be because of some contaminant given in some industrial setting, or back in the 50s there was a lot of arsenic used in orchards and things like that. But in most cases, it's just naturally occurring arsenic. It's there. You just have to understand it. And if you happen to be in an area where there's a lot of arsenic in an aquifer, you need to treat for it. And that's really the way it goes. So you need to ask, again, your Geological Survey or DNR or Division of Environmental Quality, those organizations that either regulate well construction or drillers or water quality or community water supplies should be able to help you understand what might be in your area. And in a lot of cases, they've got maps already made that show you how much arsenic or nitrate there might be in an area, and I'll show you some examples of that. Once you know, then you can go to your local health department and ask them to explain what the ramifications of that are if you're interested. And again, it's just knowing what to ask. And when it gets to maybe the county only requires nitrate, coliform, and pH, but if I'm buying that home, I want to know in advance if there might be an arsenic or some other issue. So as examples here, I'm going to show a couple of these quickly. In Massachusetts, you can type in the address. You're buying a home in Massachusetts, you know the address, type it in. They've already developed the site to tell you, yeah, you need to be concerned about either uranium or arsenic. And if so, then you'd want to test for those things. This is Rhode Island. The little circles are areas where they're concerned about arsenic. These are all because of orchards and those types of properties. The big splotch in the middle, if you can see that, is actually beryllium. And I've been in the groundwater business for 30 years, and until I saw this webpage, I didn't know beryllium was a regulated contaminant by EPA. But it is, and it has health effects. So if you're buying a property in this area, you'd want to sample for beryllium. And so it's these sorts of sources. This is Washington State. They've got a GIS application. I went into this and told it private domestic wells with nitrate results. And you can see the outline of the state of Wisconsin or Washington here. And these are all the samples they have, 2,231 locations where they've got analysis for nitrate. So you can zoom in this viewer. You can get closer to where maybe you're buying a property, or you can see if there are other wells in the area that might have nitrate. There's a bunch of different constituents you can pick from. And I just showed this as an example. Some states really have the wherewithal and have put resources towards this. And as a realtor, this is a gold mine of information for you to use to help understand what risks might be to your client. As another example, the state of Wisconsin had Stevens Point come in and develop this viewer. It shows for all the private wells where they have analysis what the average are. This one I picked arsenic. It says display up at the upper right here. I chose arsenic, an average arsenic value by county. So it takes all the analysis they have for that county and averages it. And you can see that most of the state is less than 5 micrograms per liter, a ppb. The health standard that EPA requires for a community water supply is 10. And so anywhere that's yellow or red there, or orange, those are at 10 or higher. And you should talk to a health professional about what that risk might mean. But if I'm the buyer or the seller, I'm going to test my well, even if I've been drinking that for 30 years, before I try to put it on the market, so I know what's going on and what I might be up against. What we suggest to well owners for our class, this is the same slide I use for that. We tell people you should sample for coliform and nitrate every year. And that's, again, both of those things are typically associated with surface contamination. And if you have either one or it changes from one year to the other, if the nitrate keeps going up, that suggests that you have a pathway into your well. Initially, and what we would say to anyone selling a home or buying a home, is you should test for these things in the middle here, and every 3 to 5 years. Fluoride naturally occurs, as well as, arsenic and some other things. Also, the piping in your home makes a difference. If it's an old home, it has lead pipes. You see lead first draw in the morning. Whenever you first take, you should always let your water run. Changing out your pipes is an expensive proposition, but knowing that it's there is also valuable. And in some parts of the country, they use a lot of galvanized piping for the well itself, the well casing. In those cases, not only zinc and cadmium, but lead can be an issue if it's corrosive water. And there's a lot of new research coming out on that from North Carolina and Virginia Tech that show you can't follow the old adage, when I turn on my faucet in the morning, I can let it run for 10 minutes, and then any lead that's leached during overnight has been flushed out, and now the water's coming from my well and it's not an issue. They're seeing lead as late as 20 or 30 minutes into a running faucet because it's actually leaching from inside the well. And so understanding all those issues, the main thing like the fluoride and the iron, those things shouldn't change a lot from the aquifer perspective. So well water should be fairly, manganese and sulfate and some of those things, the pH, they should remain fairly consistent over time. Groundwater doesn't change that dramatically unless something's changed near the well or in the well. And so that's why we say every 3 to 5 years. If, all of a sudden you have a lot of turbidity or TDS, or your pHs went from, 6.8 to 8.6, something's changed, and you should investigate or have the health department ask them if they have any suggestions on what might have happened with your well or nearby that might cause a change in water quality. And I understand that's not an issue for a sale of a property, but that's why we would suggest sampling for these things, as well as anything else that might be a constituent of concern locally. And again, your local or state health department should be able to tell you if there's any of those issues, like the ones we just showed. So the third thing is to be informed, both yourself and help inform your client. And, the point there is there's a lot of resources available for a well owner or a potential well owner. You can create your own web page that might have those resources available. You can become informed and take our class, as well as look at other resources, which we provide a lot of resources from other agencies and entities around the country on our website, because we realize that, one, we can't cover everything in our class, and there are local issues that you might have to deal with that are just a small pocket of problem, if you will, around the country. But to educate yourself as well as your client, that'll show when you're showing a home, or you're talking to a well owner, or you're talking to the inspector. Again, there's a lot of valuable information in our class. We certainly recommend that you take it. And, just as an example, this is Illinois DPH. They just put this new page up not too long ago. There's a lot of information. If you look on the right side, a list of accredited labs in Illinois for water testing. That's one of the things we recommend. If you're going to test your well, you should probably use an accredited lab, because they've went through the trouble of ensuring that the work they do is quality assurance and quality control tested, and it meets in our case in Illinois, the Illinois EPA's requirements for community water supply testing. And a lot of those labs also do private well testing. Some don't, but you can look at that. They have this ArcMS IMS mapping tool that's similar to the two maps I showed. It doesn't necessarily have all the water quality information, but it shows a lot of other information about wells and water use and things like that. The State Geological Survey has this ill water program, and you can look at any well log in the state from this interactive map. And, even if you're thinking about putting a new well in, or you're not sure about the well, or in some cases there may not be a well log available. Actually, that's probably, I would guess in most areas, especially rural areas, probably half or more of the time, a well log isn't available for a well. You have to rely on the owner, or if they remember who the driller is. The driller may not be drilling anymore. Some of these wells are more than 40 or 50 years old. But if you have access to the State Geological Survey's program, which is publicly available, you can go in and look at the area where your property is and look at all the other wells around it. And, if there's a good aquifer there, most of the wells are going to be nearly the same depth. They're going to be drilled fairly similar in construction, all those issues, and you can get an idea of what's likely to be the construction of your well. And then you can follow that up then, and that's what an inspector might do as well, as well as going and measure the depth of the well or that sort of thing. So this information is valuable. You can link to it. Here's Wisconsin DNR's page for well owners. They also have a page for property transfers with a lot of really good information on it. You can see the button up here in the upper right, which I don't think I showed, but here's an example. This person contacted us a few months ago. They're a realtor in Colorado. Marcia Looper's her name. They wanted to just ask if they could link to our class. They think it's good information. They linked to the Colorado Division of Water Resources. They found a lot of videos. You know, the little video here in the lower right that says components of a well system. It's amazing how simple that video is, but it's how many people don't realize, you know, how water gets from your well to your faucet and what it takes to do that. And whether that's with a pressure tank that shows here, or whether it's a really small tank with a, you know, a variable speed pump, all those things matter. And it's done in a way they've actually linked to other people's videos here, and this goes down further on the page, but it's information that you can use to help understand what you might be getting into as maybe a new private well owner. So that's what I have as far as my presentation. We had 160 or so people register for this webinar, and it looks like we have a little less than half that actually are online. But we went through all the questions we received, and we don't have them all answered. Some we just got this morning, but we've went out and tried to get answers to everything we could, and a few we had to send out. You know, there were questions about HUD and FHA loans. You know, it's ambiguous. I found information on their website in one place that said you can sample for these constituents on their FAQ, and then when I emailed them and asked I said, hey, it's ambiguous. One thing says this, one thing says that. I just got a response this morning basically saying what I'd mentioned earlier. In lack of any other jurisdiction having rules for sampling, you have to follow the EPA's MCLs, which is a whole other issue for anyone who has to do an inspection or who's a groundwater professional who's inspecting a well. So I want to mention that we're developing a web page that will have all of the questions we've been asked. We've probably done about 10 or 12 webinars now over the last 2 or 3 years, and we've kept all the questions we've gotten, and we've developed answers for all of those, and we're in the process of creating an FAQ that's kind of a searchable database so that you don't have to just scroll through a big long list of questions. You can search by keyword or topic, and we're probably 4 to 6 months away from having that live. We just upgraded our site, if you will, and so it has a new look, and we've added videos and podcasts and some of those things. But we're also considering developing a Realtors page just to provide some of the resources we've found and information on, you know, shared wells and, you know, things that different states have for rules that are unique, if you will. So I'm just going to go into the questions and go through them. There's probably about 10 or 15 here, and then if we have time, if anyone is asking questions through the GoToWebinar window, we'll try to get to those as well. First, what's the cost of a well inspection? So Katie Hollenbeck, who is part of our team, looked online and found some information. Most inspections take 1 to 3 hours. They cost between $200 and $600 plus the cost of a water sample. Some states that require an inspection, or if you're going to do an inspection, also require you to do a water sample as well. So it really depends on where you're at, and you need to talk to, like in Wisconsin, talk to your DNR. They can give you that information. And, you know, HUD, for instance, for FHA loans, there's a clause in there that says a well has to meet at least 3 to 5 gallons per minute. I believe that's the case. And so that might require more effort, because to ensure that, you know, as a groundwater hydrologist, what I would do is I would measure the water level, turn on the pump, and run as much water as I can until I know the pump's kicking on, and then I would see if the well goes to a static water level or a pumping water level that still keeps up, if you will. And so then you can get an idea of how much you're pumping. Say it's 8 gallons a minute or 10 gallons a minute, and you can say there's a static water level and a pumping water level, and from the difference you can determine what the specific capacity of the well is, which tells you how much it'll produce and when you're likely to have issues. For a well that's really low yielding, if you pump it very hard, eventually the water is going to go down to where the pump intake is, and it can either, if it's a submersible pump, The pump might be out of water and it'll overheat and ruin your pump, or it'll certainly lose suction and not operate properly. So there's a lot of different issues to this. It could be more. It kind of depends on the situation. And part of the job of the inspector is to also look at some of those other factors, like is the well more than 50 feet from a septic system, or how far is it? All those sorts of things. And so but it's worthwhile because it's someone who, and I would always use a qualified contractor to do an inspection. I know in some cases, because they're not required by law, there may be groups out there who do these inspections, but I would certainly investigate them in advance and make sure they're not just somebody's cousin who can do this for you, and someone who actually understands wells and the risks associated with. So the thing here at the bottom, in New Jersey, they passed a law about 15 years ago that says for every sale of property that has a well, you're required to have the state lab come out and collect a water sample. The buyer and the seller have to agree on who's going to pay for it. At the time, it was $600. I'm not sure what it is today, but the result of that is they sample for a big range of constituents, and they get about 13,000 samples a year from this program. So now 15 years later, the state of New Jersey has about 180,000 water quality samples for private wells in New Jersey. So I guarantee you they know where there's arsenic and where there might be nitrate problems or any other type of contaminant. And it's data that they don't share. You can't get the information unless you're the buyer or the seller. And they only put out maps that show where these issues are. But it's from as a scientist, from my standpoint, if every state had a law like that, we would know a lot more about what the water quality issues are, at least in the aquifers in our area. This doesn't address one of the biggest problems with most wells, and that's well construction and proper construction of a well. Those are an individual issue, and there's no way to solve that as far as in aggregate, if you will. We're seeing higher levels of arsenic on average in our state. Is that caused by chemicals the farmers are adding to their fields? I guess I left a little bit out there. Arsenic really isn't used at all in farming operations, and it hasn't been for a long time. Again, as I mentioned before, it's a naturally occurring contaminant. We know in glaciated areas like Illinois, Iowa, in the northern part of the country, a lot of the sand and gravels have arsenic just in the matrix of the grains. It's you've all heard of pyrite, iron pyrite. Well, there's a version of that called arsenopyrite that it's an iron pyrite that also has arsenic bound to it, and it really depends on the chemistry of the water. The more reducing it is, the more likely that is to come off of that mineral and get into the water and stay there. And in Illinois, we see that in some areas where there's sand and gravel aquifers, and in other areas, it's also really high in arsenic. I mentioned Wisconsin earlier. There's a bedrock aquifer that's fairly deep that has really high arsenic in the thousands micrograms per liter. And so it's not caused by farming. It's naturally occurring. And I think if you talk to health professionals and your state agencies that deal with these issues, again, DNR or Department of Environmental Quality, those sorts of groups, there's always people there who are willing to help. And you should lean on them. That's what they're for. That's what your tax dollars are for. They're here to help. And, because, so many well owners believe that if I go to the health department, they're going to tell me I can't use my well. And that's just not the truth. There's only a few places in the country where that can occur, and there are counties where they passed more stringent laws. But in general, in most places in the country, you're on your own as a well owner. And that's why realtors and other professionals who are working with well owners need to have their back, so to speak. So what responsibility does a realtor have if there is an old, large diameter well on the property that they're listing or showing? Well, legally it depends on the state. In a lot of cases there's probably no responsibility, but failure to disclose that is both a disservice to you and your client and everyone else. In Minnesota, they have a law that says you have to provide a diagram listing every well on the property. It's a well disclosure law, and really in the end, if that happens very often, word's going to get around and you're going to lose your credibility. If it's better to face these things up front and take care of them. I know in a lot of states, the soil and water conservation districts have programs where they will cost share sealing a well, or in some, like in Iowa, for instance, They have a grants to counties program where the counties can get funding either to seal abandoned wells or to help pay for sampling costs for well owners. You should check out those programs, see if your state or your soil and water conservation district may have something available. So more about abandoned wells. Since it came up, they're a huge problem. So in Illinois, we may have 500,000 well logs on file here. There's probably another 300,000 to 500,000 wells that we don't have logs for because they're older wells or a log was never filed that are in use. So we have 800,000 to 1 million private wells in use. There's probably close to that many abandoned wells that aren't being used that haven't been sealed. So it's a huge issue. People think, well, you never hear about it. It must not be that big of an issue. If you have an abandoned well on a property, it needs to be sealed. And if you're working with someone who has an abandoned well, you should probably convince them to do that. Certainly disclose it, but if not, it needs to be addressed because if anyone walks on that property and falls in a well, there's a lot of liability there, and it can also contaminate an aquifer. Here's my example. So the two pictures on the left are from Washington State Department of Ecology. They're the agency in Washington that regulates well construction and drillers. So they have a blog, and I got these both. They're both within about 4 months of each other. They had on their blog, guy fell 45 feet into the well. He survived. That's pretty lucky. And they're trying to get a horse out of this other old well. And it happens a lot more than you think. These 4 newspaper clippings on the right, the first 2 and the last one are all in Illinois. The third one is Jessica McClure. Anyone who's old enough certainly remembers when baby Jessica was in a well for 18 hours in Texas. It was on CNN Live coverage and all that stuff. But the other 3 are all communities in Illinois. Sangamon County is at Springfield, our state capital. The girl 10 who died is Buffalo Grove, is a Chicago suburb, and Galesburg is in western Illinois. These things happen, and they only make it into a local or regional paper. I guarantee you the people in Sangamon County didn't know about the person in Galesburg, and these all happened in the same year. So the issue is that there's not enough media coverage for everyone to really realize how often it happens. It's a tremendous issue, and anytime that you come across an abandoned well, especially an old dug well that could provide, some people think, oh, there's this big hole in the ground, I'll just pour my stuff down it, or I'll throw stuff down it and fill it up. That's, you might be contaminating an aquifer doing those sorts of things. They need to be filled in properly, and your state has recommendations for how to do that and to ensure that it's properly sealed. So, moving on. How can I work with lenders that require a well to meet more restrictive requirements than my state's well construction code? Well, it's really not about the state's code. It's about protecting the value of the home in case of foreclosure. At least that's what I've read, and it makes sense. So it depends on the state. In Wisconsin, for example, they allow sand points, and FHA doesn't allow sand points. Well, that doesn't mean that FHA is being unreasonable. It means that every state has different rules, and the best example of that is Pennsylvania. They don't have any well construction code. So in Wisconsin, you can put in a sandpoint well, and if they require you to not only file a log, but also make sure it meets all the setback requirements and all those things that are for anybody, but a homeowner or a contractor can put in a sandpoint well. In Illinois, it's just a homeowner can put in a sandpoint well. Well drillers aren't allowed to. They have to drill wells that meet our code, which says it has to meet certain requirements. This is on Wisconsin Department of Conservation and Natural Resources webpage. They have a little button that says recommendations for construction of private wells. It's a recommendation because if you read the little gray part I highlighted there, the state of Pennsylvania does not regulate the construction details of private water wells, which means a driller can drill a well and use whatever material he wants. He can do whatever he wants. He cannot grout it if he doesn't want to. He can do whatever he wants as long as the person who's paying him agrees to it. So it's about being informed and understanding that if you're in Pennsylvania, you need to take the extra step and make sure that if somebody's putting in a well on a property, that they're doing it according to maybe another state code. Or, some of the counties in Pennsylvania have taken things in their own hands. They require a driller to be licensed and also certified through the National Groundwater Association as a master well driller, things like that. But getting back to the question, and I'll go backwards here, it's not about If they're more restrictive, it's for a reason, and if that is a problem for the property, then that's unfortunate. But especially like in the case of a Sandpoint well, if they want to get an FHA loan, then they need to have another well put in. And what we tell people all the time related to Sandpoint wells, there's no grout. They're pushed in at the surface. They're usually in sandy areas, which means there's more infiltration of surface contaminants. If you're going to, I would get rid of a Sandpoint well if I had one. I would put in a drilled well that's got a screen, and I would go all the way to the bottom of the aquifer. And maybe that's only 40 feet, or maybe it's 100 feet. But if it's 100 feet to bedrock and it's sand from 0 to 100, I would put a well in that has a screen from 95 to 100 so that I'm more sure and have better protection of anything from the surface getting in my well. So shared wells, there are several questions about shared wells. How do they work? How are they treated differently? And again, like a lot of things I'm going to say here, it depends on the state, it depends on the lender. They're best to be avoided. And typically, I'll go to the middle one here first. Typically, it's a private agreement between landowners. And so when a property is sold, it depends on whose property the well is on, what is in the agreement. If you're looking at a property that's on a shared well, you need to make sure before you buy that you have an agreement that's legally binding that allows you to use that well and share in the expenses, and that doesn't limit how much water you can use and that sort of thing. In Texas, they allow it. They even allow people to pay a landowner who has a well, and so you can set up an agreement where you're paying for your water from another private person. Many states don't allow that. If you're going to purvey water and make money off of it, you have to be considered a public water supply and follow and test and have a licensed operator. And so it really just depends. FHA won't provide a loan without a legal agreement in place that ensures that they're going to have enough water to use. And in Washington State, they've taken it down. Their primacy agency that regulates community water supplies and public water supplies has a special provision for anyone that has even 2 homes on one well. And that's all basically come about because of water rights there. And you don't necessarily, you buy a property in Washington State, you don't necessarily have a right to put in a well and take water, depending on the situation. And that's the case in several states out west, including Oregon, I believe. So you really need to do your homework, and it's not a simple question, and that's why I'm just giving you some of the range of things that you need to be concerned about. How can you determine if the odor in your well is from sulfur or iron bacteria? There's information at these websites, and I think what we'll do, I haven't talked to Jennifer or Katie yet about this, but we've come across a lot of information looking things up on the web or talking to folks on the phone, and we'll probably put together a list of URLs like these 2 that are shown here, and we'll just send it out to everybody that registered for the webinar today. I think that's what we did last time. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a lot of good information available if you know where to find it. And one of our chemists came across, found this information out for us. Really the difference is, iron bacteria can smell like sulfur, rotten eggs. But most of the time if it's an iron bacteria problem, there's other issues. Like if you have a toilet that isn't being used very often, open up the tank and look. If you have orange slime in there, then it's probably iron bacteria. And in either case, the way to control it is with continuous chlorination. And you can get an inline chlorinator. I know, again, that's an expense, but if it's going to save you those issues, they're worth having. And it also protects you from any other bacterial issues that you might have. And, an inline chlorinator is continuous chlorination similar to what you would have if you're on a community water supply. And that reminds me, we got a question about someone having the opportunity to either be on a private well or on a community water supply, and which they should choose and which is an advantage. We see so many well owners who don't understand what it takes to manage a well, maintain treatment, ensure it's tested, ensure that nothing has changed with the well. I can't think of a situation where I wouldn't recommend they go on city water if they have the opportunity, at least for their drinking water. It's just, it's an assurance that the community, by law, has to meet the EPA regulations for all the primary drinking water standards. There's a licensed operator who's ensuring that the water is safe to drink, that it's always going to be available, that you don't have to worry about things depending on where you're at in the country. We had to worry about our well house having a propane heater in the winter because if the power went out, our pipes might freeze. All those sorts of things that you may not consider. Again, it's just it's the way to go. If you could go get on city water. Matter of fact, the FHA regulations now say that if you have the opportunity at a reasonable cost to hook up to city water or community water supply or public water supply, they expect you to do that first. And if that's not available, then they'll consider giving a loan to someone with a private well. And that's for good reason. So how much does a new well cost? Again, Katie Hollenbeck, what we asked her to do is just, the National Groundwater Association has a list of contractors and well drillers on their website. You can type in the state and it'll give you a list of drillers. And so I asked her to call a number of states and just pick a driller. Ask them for a 300-foot well in bedrock, that's 6-inch steel casing. I didn't say with the tank and water lines, but some of them gave that to us. And so here's the variability in costs. In Missouri, it was $8,500, and that included a pressure tank and water lines and all that stuff. In New Jersey, total, it was $24,000 to $28,000. Just for the well and pump only. In South Carolina, it's $5,700. And you can see here in Michigan, the driller she talked to said, well, for a PVC well, it's $10,000 to $13,000. But if you want a steel well, it's going to be $30,000 to $50,000. And so, it just really depends on where you're at. In California, because of the drought, there's wells that are going dry that their drillers are now drilling 300 or 400 feet deeper than they were before. There's not only a waiting list of 6 months to a year to get a new well, but you're looking at $40,000 or $50,000 for an individual well in California in some places. So, it's the best thing to do is to look up a few drillers in an area and ask them what it might cost. One, you want to use a local driller if you can, because they're more familiar with the geology of the area and they probably drilled wells nearby. And so they, one, give you the best bet for finding water if it's difficult and also understanding what the needs are. And that doesn't always hold up. One example, in northern Illinois, there's a driller who always drilled into bedrock. And he started drilling further south, and he'd run into these areas where there might be a 30 or 40-foot sand and gravel aquifer at, say, 100 feet above bedrock. And he would blow right through that and drill a 300-foot well into bedrock because that's what he's always done. And doesn't want to use a screen, that sort of thing. In that case, if you know there's a sand and gravel aquifer there, you need to insist on it. And if that driller won't do it, find another driller, because it's just ridiculous to, usually you're paying by foot. It depends on the driller, but most of the time there's a set cost and then a per foot cost over a certain amount, that sort of thing. So it's in your best interest if you have to put in a new well or you're going to recommend that to somebody that you find the best cost and that they're they have to be licensed and all that stuff too. So how long does a pump last? Someone asked this question. It's interesting because you can see the variability here. In Missouri, the driller said, I've seen them 7 to 60 years, but 15 to 25 typically, 20 to 30, 7 to 20 or 30, typically 10. And then the guy in Washington State, 6 or 7 years, they're not as good as they used to be. And so, and that's going to vary. If we called 10 drillers in Washington State, we'd probably get 10 different answers. From my experience, isn't a lot. I would say it's probably close to 15 or 20 years. Sometimes they can last a lot longer. It's just like your sump. If you have a sump pump in your basement, it may go out after 5 years, but a lot of times they're still working and working fine 20 years later. They're a mechanical device. It depends on how they're used, how hard they're used. That gets into some of the things in our class. If my pump's cycling on and off a lot, then you probably have a problem. It could be a bladder tank or some other issue. You need to understand those things in order to protect your pump and make sure it's not running more than it needs to. Are well points legal in Wisconsin? Well, I think we've already answered that. I talked to Lisa Lehman, who runs the private well section for DNR, and there's information on their website, and either a well owner or a contractor can install it. But if they're going to install their own well, they still have to follow the rules. File a log, meet all the setback requirements, and I'm sure there's some things I'm leaving out. I would call DNR and ask them the way to go. And in Illinois, as an individual, if I buy a property, I can put a point well in, but a contractor can't do it for me. They need to follow our code, which doesn't allow point wells. And so it just varies state to state again, and I just wanted to point that out. Someone asked, what are the considerations for POU versus POE? Well, POU is point of use, and POE is point of entry. And what they refer to is basically point of use means you're treating the water at the tap where you're going to take the water out. So like at your kitchen sink, you see a lot of RO units that are underneath the sink, and you have a separate tap, and that's what you use for your drinking water and the water you cook with. Versus point of entry, that means where it enters the house. So you're basically, it depends on the contaminant and whether it's just a risk if you drink it, or if it's also a risk if it gets in the air or on your skin. So you certainly don't want to take a shower with some constituent or contaminant that may be a problem, or even if, for in the case of bacteria, what I'm thinking there is you might want to have an inline chlorinator, because even in the shower, you're liable to swallow some water, and if there's bacteria in it, it's a acute contaminant, it could certainly cause a problem. So it really depends on what constituent is in your water. Most of the time, you would hope you could use a POU unit because of this third bullet here. You're treating all the water that comes in your home, everything that goes through your dishwasher, your laundry, your shower, if you're using a POE unit. And that means, depending on what it is, if it's got a filter or a cartridge that has to be changed, the more water you put through it, the more cartridges you need, and the more often it needs to be replaced. And so it means more cost and more maintenance. And so you certainly want to use a POU unit versus a POE if it's appropriate. And again, if you have a bacteria issue and there's just no other water available, and you have a bored well and it's going to have bacteria in it for some reason, it shouldn't be that way, but if it is, you use a continuous chlorinator, you'd want to do the whole house. So what are the standards? Are there standards for water pressure and water quantity? I don't know of any standards for pressure. Usually you make sure that you have enough pressure at the highest point in your home, so that, if you have a shower on the second or third floor, you need enough pressure that you're going to have a decent shower pressure up there. The way these systems work is there's a cut-in pressure and a cut-out pressure. If you're using a bladder tank, a pressure tank to supply water to your home, it keeps a certain amount of pressure in that tank so that it can push water through your home. And so a lot of times those are set to 30 and 60, or 30 and 50, or 40 and 60 psi. And the point of that is your pump will run until your pressure tank gets to 60 psi, then your pump stops. Then as you use water, water's pushed out of your pressure tank from a bladder, and the pressure starts going down. And when it gets down to 40, let's say, then a sensor goes off and tells your pump to kick back on. And that way you ensure that you've always got at least 40 pounds of pressure, if that's what you need. As far as quantity goes, there are a lot of wells out there that only pump 1 gallon a minute or less. This Colorado example, we had a person contact us and asked if he had any choice. He's on the western slope of a mountain range in Colorado, and he's got a well that's in granite, which isn't known to be very fractured, and he can only pump about 1 gallon a minute. Actually, I think it's a half gallon a minute. And so what they came up with for a solution, because he's out in the middle of nowhere, there's no other water source available, is they put in a 3,000-gallon cistern that he actually has a pump in, and his well basically pumps half a gallon a minute 24/7, and it pumps into that cistern. And so that overnight while they're sleeping, it starts filling it up. In the morning they use the water, they take showers whenever they do their laundry, all those things. It takes water out of the cistern. They can manage the pressure that way, and that's how they get around only being able to pump a half gallon a minute. You're not going to have livestock, or you're not going to water your lawn, or some of those things, because eventually you'll run out and well can't keep up. And so it really depends. I read somewhere on an FHA website that they want at least 3 to 5 gallons per minute, and I haven't been able to confirm that, so that's why I put I believe. The issue here is a groundwater professional. If I'm asked to do an inspection and determine if a well pumps at least 3 to 5 gallons a minute, that would require me to basically do a pumping test on the well to determine what the static level is and the pumping level is. I mentioned this earlier, so that I can be sure that, one, after you're pumping for an hour, the water level isn't still dropping, which means eventually the well's going to run out of water, and those sorts of things, and determine a specific capacity and some of the properties that indicate how much water can get into the well and it can maintain. A lot of times, in some areas like sandy areas we have here in Illinois, there are irrigation wells that can sustain pumping 1,500 gallons a minute. or a large community well that might pump 2,000 gallons a minute, and they can do that forever just because of how good the aquifer is and how big the screen is and some of those things. But if we get into this like Colorado example, that guy wouldn't have been able to get an FHA loan for his property if he needed it. So, or if somebody wants to buy it, because that well will not pump 3 to 5 gallons a minute. Okay, so what constitutes, or what constituents are concerned in my region in southeast Wisconsin? So I talked to Lisa, I also talked to at DNR, and I talked to Kristen Malecki at UW-Madison. I met at a private well conference last year, so I contacted her. Nitrates, low levels of pesticides can be an issue, also some arsenic. There's a few other things that might be an issue in southwest Wisconsin, but I'm using this question to show off what Wisconsin has. Other states like Washington State have something similar. Every state should have one of these programs. And so I showed this earlier, and this is the Center for Watershed Science and Education at Stevens Point. I'm guessing that DNR funded all this because the private well data is likely theirs. But this shows the average arsenic by county, and you can see there's a few counties that are blank, and that means there were no samples. And I point that out because there's other things you can display up here. Up on the right it says arsenic, but if I go to arsenic max, that means any individual sample, the highest one in the county, you can see how if I go back here, the red is 21 or higher on this average, and on the max it's 151 or higher. So you have a big range what arsenic can be. In some cases, in Illinois anyway, I've done a lot of arsenic sampling myself. We've seen in the one aquifer where we have a lot of arsenic, we've certainly seen values over 250, and the standard is 10 for a community water supply or a public water supply. So it just shows you the difference here. This shouldn't raise an alarm. For a lot of people, it probably would, but it doesn't mean because a county is red that everyone in the county has arsenic issues. Matter of fact, it can vary over a very small distance. So there's another way to look at this data. It says up at the top here by county, by township, or by section. So a section is a 1 mile square. So on this map, that's going to be pretty tiny. But if I show that, and I zoomed in a little bit, this is the maximum arsenic by section. So all those little dots are 1 mile squares, and you can see how many of them are blue. So even in the counties where there might be yellow or red, on average, a lot of the samples, like the one right in the center below Route 8, most of the samples are not detected. So the deal with this is when you use this sort of information, you need to understand how to use it. And what I would do if I were a realtor in Wisconsin or a well owner is I would contact DNR or the folks at, well, that's who I would contact, and ask them to walk through this with me and explain what it means. Because you can see, like over by Fond du Lac, there's a couple counties there where there's a lot that isn't blue. Most of the samples have at least 10 or higher, but that's the area of Wisconsin where there's more of a concern. In a lot of the rest of the area, it's more than likely that your well's going to come back with a non-detect or a low value. And so it just, you need to take the data for what it really is. And, some of those counties up by Duluth, there's only 3 or 2 or 5 samples, and so it's really not a representative sample. But that's why you need to look at this information and understand it. And I just want to make that clarification because when you see this figure before, that's a pretty scary looking figure for a lot of folks. And it really doesn't need to be. It's still good because it makes you aware, but you should follow up and ask. Even for these mapping things, not necessarily on water quality issues, but for something like this, I would follow up with someone and try to get a qualified answer, at least have them explain what all this means. And like I said, this really puts it in perspective. So I think I only have a couple more questions, and I know I'm already running long, but why isn't arsenic a standard test when a buyer or lender requests a water test? Well owners assume it's safe, even if only tested for nitrate, bacteria, and pH. I modified the question a little bit from the person who asked this, but it's really true. People don't understand what they need to test for. So if someone tells them, yeah, test for nitrate, bacteria, and pH, and then if it comes back clear, your well's good, they just believe that it is. You may have that beryllium if you're in Rhode Island, or you may have arsenic if you're in the one aquifer in Illinois where we have it. So that's why I went through all of this with you today about naturally occurring contaminants and who to ask and where to look, because you need to be informed. And, this is why we do what we do. We want everyone to understand that it's not a simple, oh yeah, my well's safe, or well, my well's not safe. You need to know how your well's constructed. You need to know if it's protected at the surface. You need to know if you're in a sandy soil versus a clay soil, so that things can just run in the ground, or if they're going to run off. You need to understand what the dynamics are related to how water gets into your well, how contaminants might get into your well, and what might be in the ground already naturally occurring, like arsenic, that can get into your well. And, arsenic's not everywhere. We did a survey of state primacy agencies for a different project I'm involved with, looking at treatment. And we had a number of states who said, we don't have arsenic issues in our state, but it still occurs in the majority of states, and certainly in isolated areas. So, does everyone need to sample for it? Not necessarily. You as a realtor, that's a really good question to ask if you're concerned about it. And, for instance, Champaign County, where I live, we have detected a little arsenic in our sand and gravel aquifer here, but it's very minimal and very sporadic. But if you follow the same aquifer 100 miles west, closer to the Illinois River, then we start seeing a lot more arsenic. And it's based on how reducing the water chemistry is and how much source arsenic there is in the arsenopyrite that I mentioned earlier that's actually in the sand and gravel. And so it's just how the Mother Nature laid the glacier material down, and there's no rhyme or reason. But again, if you ask your county health department and your state agencies that are involved with this, they'll be able to tell you, and that's why you need to ask. How do you disinfect a well? Every county, not every county, but many counties and many state agencies have a set of recommendations for disinfecting a well. For our class, for the private well class, I went through probably 50 of these documents, and I settled on one, just because I wanted to be consistent, and because the Minnesota Department of Health is a very active agency when it comes to private well issues. And so I liked theirs the best of all of them that I came across. It talks about, explains what disinfection is and why you need to do it, and, turning off the power and why you don't just pour Clorox down your well. You mix it first. There's a lot of recommendations that go into this. Here's, it walks you through step by step what to do. It even has information on if you have a softener or a filter, you can go to the Water Quality Association, you can call the Water Quality Association, or you can use these basic rules that they've developed on how to disinfect those things as well. Because if you have a bacteria problem, it's in all your water. You need to disinfect your softener, you need to disinfect every line in your house, every filter, everything, so that there's no chance that there's any bacteria left. And so if you go on our webpage, I think under Lesson 9, where we have a list of resources, and we'll provide this link as well, but it lists a link to this PDF, which I think, it's a number of pages long. It's very detailed and provides a lot of good information. And it's really something that anyone can follow that's disinfecting a well. Quickly, a little about the private well class. It's 10 lessons. You go online, you sign up, and you just give your email address, your first name, and what state you're from, and it sends you a lesson right when you do that, and then one every week for 9 more weeks after that. We're doing these webinars, which we mentioned. They're topic-centered, sort of, more question and answer, and they support what's in the lessons, but there's a lot more detail. They're PDFs. They're 4 to 8 pages each, and they're on a specific topic. I'm not sure if I have this here or not. I do. All the way from the basics of geology and how water gets into your well to, how contaminants move, and, RO is shown here, how treatment systems work, why my pump cycle's on and off, problems with my pressure tank, what to do with your sample results, the whole gamut of what we feel, or what I feel, a well owner needs to understand as a steward of their well, both from protecting their public health and also for source water protection. It's really worthwhile. It's a little effort to go through. A lot of times when well owners call us, they want an answer to a problem. And, we're not in it, or I'm not in it for that. This class is meant to be something for people who really want to understand how to take care of the well and ensure it's going to last a long time and it's going to be safe. And so that's the way we've developed this. This is the front page. You click on either on the big picture or on the Learn by Email, and it takes you to a place to sign up. We've started developing podcasts, and also we have videos that we've developed. Both here on the left are informational videos that are all short, 2 to 5 minutes long. What is an artesian well? What's an aquifer? What do I do with the seasonal well? all the way to on the right here are all the recordings like this presentation I'm doing today. We're recording it. It'll be up on this website probably within a week, maybe sooner, so that other folks who couldn't be here today and are interested can watch it and get all the resources and that sort of thing. So it's really meant to be useful information. It's all funded through the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, RCAP, by the US EPA, so everything's free. And that's the nice thing about doing this work, is that we can provide this, and it's all free to anyone who's interested. So this is just an example. In the resources library for each lesson, there's a number of resources that we've either used figures out of, or we think supplement the material. In writing the text for this, you may not like the way our class is written. These materials all support what's in that lesson 1, and you can go through those and maybe it'll make more sense to you. But one of the biggest things we tell people at the end, once they've done the evaluation, is you should take a look at some of these other resources. They really reinforce what we're trying to tell you. So the goal of the class is really to help well owners understand, and stakeholders like realtors, why a well is important, why you need to understand how it works, and in doing so you can protect yourself from risk as a well owner. So we're going to take a minute break. Actually, I'm not sure we need to, but we've got questions that everybody has been asking, and Katie and Jennifer have been pulling those up in a Google document that we can all share. And so I'm going to try to do that, I guess. And I think Dan Webb has joined us as well. So if there are any questions about water quality that I can't answer, I'm sure Dan can. I'm going to slide this over. And if you can't see this, somebody needs to let me know. But I'm just going to start in, I guess. That works for everybody. So the first question is, does arsenic need to be checked annually? I would say no. Arsenic's one of those constituents that isn't a surface contaminant, except in a very isolated case where there may have been some type of industrial use that you happen to live next to some kind of facility that would have been using arsenic. And it's really naturally occurring. It's in the groundwater. So if what we see from wells we've sampled long term is if your arsenic is at 40 ppb, it's always going to be between 30 and 50 every time you sample. And if it's at 2, it's always going to be between non-detect and 4. That's just kind of an average. But yeah, again, I would say stick with every 3 years. If it's above 10, you should add treatment, probably. I mean, the EPA sets the health standards for a reason. There's people who will tell you, well, it used to be 50 ppb, which is until 2006, the arsenic standard was 50. And there are folks who will say, well, I've drank this water for 50 years, and I'm 86 years old, and the arsenic's 30, and it's never bothered me. Well, what the EPA standards mean is that there's an increased chance that it can cause some adverse health effect. And for arsenic, it's cancer. And so, it doesn't necessarily affect everybody, and there's a lot of other factors. But my take on it is we should all do what we can to minimize our risks for adverse health effects. So I think the next one's for Dan. It looks like you guys have already started answering these questions. Hawk has a number of test papers. I'm not aware of that. Dan, do you want to chime in?
Sure. Can you hear me, Steve?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can get them online. I think for the test papers, you can look at like a pool store or an aquarium store. The aquarium stores will have papers and also likely droplet kits that sometimes tend to be a little more accurate than the papers. But they should be available in most communities in those types of stores.
Now, that's just for pH, right?
You can get pH. pH is probably the most common, but they'll have nitrate kits. In the pet stores, they'll have nitrate and phosphate and ammonia kits. Not really. I think you'll see arsenic and lead kits sometimes, but I'm not sure how much. I don't really have much experience with them, so I don't know how much you can trust them. At sometimes the really low levels tend to give false positives and false negatives.
Sure. Well, and this is something we can investigate and add to our FAQ, too. So, yeah. So what is an artesian well? Well, if you noticed a minute ago, that was one of the videos we have, and it probably explains it pretty well. But basically, there's 2 types of aquifers. There's either confined or unconfined. And an unconfined aquifer is usually not full. So there's a water surface, and at that water surface, it's at atmospheric pressure. So whenever you have a well that's in an unconfined aquifer, the water level in the aquifer is also the water level in the well. But sometimes when an aquifer is confined, which means that there might be some kind of confining layer above the aquifer, like a clay or a shale, so that when you drill down through that and get into the aquifer, the water in the aquifer could be under pressure. And anytime the water comes up in a well above the top of the aquifer, that means the aquifer is completely saturated and it's under pressure, which forces the water up. It's just like if you squeeze a juice box. You know, those little juice boxes, you put a straw in them, you squeeze them, water comes out the straw. And that's, you know, if that happens, you drill a well, maybe you're in a lower location on the landscape, and you drill a well, it might flow. There's a lot of flowing wells, especially in Wisconsin, Michigan. There's a few in Illinois in some places. That's because there's enough pressure on the aquifer that it makes the water level rise above land surface. And so those can be capped, those sorts of things. But an artesian well means it's a well under pressure, and the water level, you know, so the water will come up in a well until the pressure of the air in the atmosphere pushes down and holds it in place. So it's as high up as it comes, that's an atmospheric pressure, and it tells you what, you know, if there were no cap on the aquifer, how high the water would come. And that happens because, you know, most aquifers are a horizontal geologic unit or semi-horizontal, but they may not be completely flat. And the recharge area for that aquifer may be at a higher elevation. So as water is recharging in one location, maybe it's a mile away or maybe 50 miles away, water's trying to flow downhill, and it pushes water in the lower parts of the aquifer to be level. It's like, you know, if you put water on a table and you tip one end of the table up, water's going to run downhill. The same way in an aquifer. Water wants to be flat and level. So if you have an area where water's coming in and being poured in, let's say, that's at a higher elevation, it's going to make the water in the lower parts of the aquifer want to be at that level as well. So watch the video. It's a good way to explain it. Another example of that would be in Chicago. A lot of communities that are Collar County communities that use groundwater are using the deep sandstone aquifer there that's between, say, 1,200 and 2,000 feet deep. The recharge area for that aquifer is over by Rockford, which is about 50 to 100 miles away. And at 50 to 100 miles away, that aquifer is at the surface. So the geology isn't flat. It's angled down from west to east towards Lake Michigan. And so at Chicago, that aquifer's, you know, over 1,000 feet below land surface. But at Rockford, it's at the surface. So water from rainfall and infiltration goes in the aquifer there, and it starts trying to wind its way into the aquifer and further to the east, and that causes pressure. So water in that aquifer in Chicago, water rises up in the well above the top of the aquifer. It's just because it's being pushed. And in the example in the video, it's we show a hose, and you lift one end of the hose and water runs out the other end. Exact same principle. So I think that's all we have, it looks like, for today. I appreciate everybody attending. And one thing I want to go back to there we go. I want to mention that this is the first time we've done this presentation for Realtors. And so we realized that there's probably things we could do better, or things that we didn't address, or concerns we might not have met. And so we certainly appreciate your comments and feedback. Our email address is on our webpage. It's info@privatewellclass.org. That's the best way probably to get a hold of us. We are going to do this webinar again down the road, probably 2 more times next year. And so we certainly want to try to meet everyone's needs and do the best we can with that. So thanks for attending, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.